We're excited to continue the celebration of Readymade Bodhisattva, the Kai anthology of South Korean science fiction in New York City this September, this time as part of the Brooklyn Book Festival BOOKEND series. And if you're going to post about the event, we ask that you use the hashtag BKBF. Transnational Sci Fi, a border-crossing otherworldly reading and discussion. So in 2019, 2 groundbreaking transnational sci-fi anthologies were published: Readymade Bodhisattva, the Kai anthology of South Korean sci-fi, and the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction, published through Hachette India. Alice Sola Kim and Nur Nasreen Ibrahim are going to be in discussion with editor Roshi Chen, and more for reading from these books, their own work, and discussion of the new frontiers of sci-fi. And we're going to start with Alice Sola Kim, who's a left-handed anchor baby currently residing in New York. Also a winner of the 2016 Whiting Award. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in places such as Tin House, The Village Voice, McSweeney's, Lenny, BuzzFeed Books, and the year's best science fiction and fantasy. She has received grants and scholarships from the MacDowell Colony, Breadloaf Writers Conference, and the Elizabeth George Foundation.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. I'm very happy to be here and to be also celebrating Readymade Bodhisattva. I'm going to first read from a story from that anthology called Between 0 and 1 by Kim Bo-young, translated by Yoonhae Jo and Melissa Maylin Chan. And all of the Korean names and phrases will be said in my trash Korean accent of a person who only spoke Korean and then forgot all Korean and back and forth forever. So I will start not at the beginning, but a little bit in. The world suddenly rattled. Mrs. Kim shook her head. Feeling dizzy, she checked her watch. The second hand, which had been hiding behind the minute hand, began moving again as if nothing had happened. It's 6:30 again, she thought to herself. How many times has it been 6:30 already? The woman sitting across from me is repeating the same sentence for the 4th or 5th time. The cookies that we just ate are here on the plate again. You can say that again, said another woman. My homeroom teacher had such a fiery temper that we couldn't buy enough mop handles to replace the broken ones. One time, he lined us all up for a caning. Some of us fainted, and some of us ended up on stretchers. Such a horrible scene. I stood at the very end of the line on purpose, but he hit me anyway until the mop handle broke. I couldn't sit down for a month. Still, I miss the old days. Even that day is a good memory. I remember running around in a short school uniform with my hair bobbed. All the boys in town would turn to look at me. I didn't like my hair at the time, so I used to fiddle with my bangs, stiffening them with glue to make them look pretty. The woman sitting across from Mrs. Kim nodded earnestly, as if this was the first time she was hearing the story. That's right, she replied. Those were the good old days. You know, we didn't have to think so much. We just did as we were told, and that was good enough. I used to eat my lunch behind my teacher's back during class, and it was so good. I bet nothing will ever taste as good as that. One day, I jumped over a fence because I really wanted to eat tteokbokki. I got caught and was called onto the carpet for a week straight. I was scolded so harshly that I still can't eat tteokbokki. But stuff like that, they're still happy memories. I really, really wanted to go to a concert, so my friends and I skipped school and took the bus there. Once my parents found out, I was whipped so harshly that I still have a scar. But that's how it is with young girls, the women said in almost perfect unison. Thump. Tell me about it. Those were the days. Time suddenly seemed to refuse to flow in one direction. It was as if time was saying, hey, whoever's controlling the universe, I'm going on strike. From now on, I'm going to take a break whenever I want and go wherever I like. Now, time was rocking back and forth on a seesaw, skipping like an old record, then rewinding like a videotape. Mrs. Kim started to feel anxious. Am I going to have to live like this until I die? Am I going to stay stuck in this neighborhood meeting forever? really can't figure out what's bothering them so much. We pay for their schooling, put a roof over their heads, keep them fed. They have everything they could ever need, don't they? We don't ask them to make money or do chores around the house. All we ask is that they sit and study. I don't understand what's so hard about that. Well, I think it's because they're so immature. Let them try to get a job with a degree from some no-name college. Then they'll wake up. Who is going to hire someone who went to some second-rate college or university? They'll regret it when they're older. Once they enter the job market, they're going to say that studying was the easiest thing they ever had to do. And then they'll start criticizing you. Mom, why didn't you push me harder? We have to push them hard now so they won't blame us later. Hey, Suai's mom, you've been pretty quiet. Only after everyone turned to look in her direction did Mrs. Kim realize they were referring to her. She shook her head. More words washed over her. How's Suai doing? Last time you were worried about her grades falling. I know a good private tutor. Do you want me to introduce him to you? He's not cheap, but the moms who've hired him all say he's worth it. Suai killed herself. Now, there was total silence. Okay, and I'm going to read from an old-ass story of mine, and I believe it was published in 2010 in Asimov's science fiction. And I'm reading this because, first of all, it's fun to kind of excavate my past, and second of all, it's my Korean-American version of trying to scam my way into college. And this is a story called The Other Graces. Your high school is said to be one of the most ethnically diverse high schools in the state, which only proves that the school board, the city, the world, people hate ethnic diversity because this high school is truly trash. They don't even offer AP classes, which is a big part of what drove you to cheat on the SAT. Because the SAT is then the only objective measure by which admissions officials will be able to determine if your waving and withered cold hand is the one that they want to yank out of the sea. Right now, you're a weirdo in a hooded sweatshirt, a skinny girl shapeless but for a gigantic ass. Think of a boa constrictor that's just eaten a goat. Stand the boa constrictor on its pointy end. The goat sliding deeper into its body in one thick lump is your ass. The rest of you, in this example, is the boa constrictor, which was chosen because they don't have tits. But someday, far in the future, you will look fine. You will have money to spend on your clothes instead of going to the thrift store and pretending that the stuff there is cool, but really everything's been picked over by tattooed 20-somethings, and all that are left are racks of sad tank tops with droopy armpits and flared stretch denim. Cruel hairstylists who are rude to everyone else, but kind and complimentary to you, will shear you into acceptability. Someday you'll learn on your own the things that no one bothered to teach you. You'll be a lovely young woman. Yes, you will. Riding the bus home after school, you think about those letters that might be in the mailbox right now. Why not? You've got a perfect 4.0, albeit the easiest 4.0 ever. Every extracurricular, a brilliant essay all about making realizations about things and stuff at important moments, and an SAT score of 2,400. Perfect. Around this time last year, you received a strange invitation to join a group on a social networking website. The group was called The Other Graces, and when you saw its members, you looked around the library in a panic and scooted your chair closer to the computer. Because the other members of The Other Graces looked just like you, but older, all different ages and hairstyles and clothing. Well, you joined. The next day, you received a message from Grace Prime, as she called herself. Grace Prime got right to it. You have been chosen for a mentorship by the Other Graces. The Other Graces are Grace chose from alternate timelines of a high fidelity to yours. We've decided to help you with your dream of acing the SAT. In order to do so, I will have to open a subspace corridor right into your brain. Please respond with your answer within 2 business days. All best, Grace Prime. You wrote back and asked her what a subspace corridor was and what it would do inside your brain. You said you needed more information before proceeding. Duh. Grace Prime called you at home later that night. How she got your number, you still don't know. It's a way of traveling between universes, said Grace Prime. You won't feel anything. Well, you may experience a side effect of odd dreams, just like here and there, but that's the nature of the beast. It's an invasion, dear, a kindly invasion, though. You don't need to be afraid. The cordless handset rested on your face. You tapped your feet on the wall. You'll all be inside my brain? For how long? Grace Prime's voice was old. Quavering old, creaky screen door old, gargling with Listerine for 1,000 years old, but strong and scary. Once created, the subspace corridor remains open for a time before fading away. It has to close on its own. It'll take time, but eventually your mind will be all yours again. I don't want a bunch of strangers running through my brain, you said. You laid back on your bed, stuck your big toe into a dent on the wall from that time you threw a desk drawer at it. See, you've caused trouble too. Grace Prime sighed. Grace, privacy is overrated, especially among those who've already thought your thoughts, or near enough. You think about that. We're not strangers. Think about what that means. Do you want a perfect score on the SAT or not? Plus, those subject tests are killer. You've not exactly had a classical education. You need the help. But it's your decision to make. You listened to the TV for a while. The way it sounded from the other room, the walls muffling its noise, made you think of someone being kidnapped. Oh, Grace. You composed an ecstatic letter in your head, like a Penthouse forum letter, except not to Penthouse. Dear amazing stories, you'll never believe what happened to me. Then, slowly, you agreed to everything. Good, Grace Prime said. You won't regret it. We get results. We change lives. Now what? Now I tell you the truth, she said. The subspace connection was already opened. It was the only way we could talk. She coughed, but not in an embarrassed way. I'm sorry. I do hate to trigger Grace. Your head jerked up just a little. The phone stayed stuck to your cheek. We're talking on the phone. You called me on the phone. Unfortunately not, she said. Sorry. The dial tone became louder, turned up and up until it was all you could hear. And then you realized that it was all you had ever been hearing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so next is Nur Nasreen Ibrahim. She's a television producer by day and writer by night. Born and raised in Pakistan, she is currently based in the United States. She's a finalist for the inaugural Salam Award for Imaginative Fiction. Her essays and reviews have appeared in Catapult, The Millions, The Collapsar, and other publications. Her fiction has appeared in Platypus Press's short series, Spectre Magazine, Salmagundi Magazine, The Olive Review, Barrel House, and in the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction from Hachette India.
Hi, everyone. So I'm starting this, my readings today both follow similar themes. They're about imagined all-female societies, utopias in some situations and dystopias in others. My first reading is from Bunyan Song's novel Perfect Society, which is also in this, it's featured in the Readymade Bodhisattva. The novel is from 1965, and it's interesting because it's a pretty chauvinist look at what an all-female society could be. From his perspective, it's kind of about a male intellectual's anxieties about the changing role of women in South Korea from the 1960s. And so it's an interesting look at like what he focuses on when he looks at how women take over a particular place. A little bit of background about the story. The novel tells a story of Sun-gu, a Korean man who awakes from 161 years of cryogenic sleep. He realizes he's the only man left on Earth. All the other men have been banished to Mars. And he finds himself in this Southern Hemisphere-based Women's Republic of Kalem. 2 world wars left the Earth engulfed in atomic pollution and leading to this creation of Amazonian women's state. They live in a techno-utopian society. Scientists are in charge. Reproduction is parthenogenetic, which means, I guess, they don't need sperm to reproduce. And everyone has a house, a job, access to education and medical care. But since this is a man who's written this story, not everything is perfect in this society. A war with Mars is looming. There's strife over sexual politics. And in Sun Gu's eyes, the narrator, the male narrator, in his eyes, the story, the society has been deprived of its male element of order. So as this is a novel, so eventually the story will talk about how Sun Gu's contribution is essential to restoring peace in Calem and ending the conflict with Mars. But in this reading today, we're going to trace his first interactions with ordinary true gendarians, which is what the citizens are called. This society is divided between the upper class Sini and the masses who are Wosidu. And here we see Sun Gu going around on a tour with his guide, Onu, and he asks to see the New Republic. In this excerpt, they'll stumble across a theater where Sun Gu asks to see the play that's being put on show. Something just outside the park caught Sun Gu's eye. Hanging from a tall pole across the street was a large billboard swaying in the wind. It read, "Now playing, Yawning for Tomorrow," by the Bluebird Theatre Group. Venue, the Park Theatre. A theatre billboard. He felt as though he were recovering a long-forgotten memory. Even the name Bluebird had a familiar ring to it. He looked around a couple of times, but wasn't able to spot anything that looked like a theatre. He turned to Onu questioningly. "It's right there," she said, pointing at a house across the road, right at the edge of the lawn. Sun Gu had seen the place too, but hadn't been able to tell what it might be based on its appearance. A modern edifice built in the shape of a big upside-down seashell. It looked like a tent that had been thrown over a pile of random objects. From afar, it didn't seem to have any windows or gates. Sun Gu went closer. 2 doors in the back of the building were hidden behind a tall wall, so the entire structure appeared to be enclosed like a bomb shelter. On the wall was a small sign that once again announced, "Yawning for Tomorrow" by the Bluebird Theatre Group. Aside from the sign and the billboard, no other flyers, posters, or promotional materials were visible. Sun Gu wondered if the company might be famous enough that it didn't need to advertise. In fact, as he was to learn later, the theater group had been struggling financially for a long time. They simply had no money to put toward promotion. But again, Sun Gu wasn't told this until later. Standing by the entrance, Sun Gu turned to his companions with an eager smile. "Shall we check it out?" Onu replied that it was up to him, but she looked puzzled when Sun Gu asked her to buy the tickets. Sun Gu had, of course, been thinking anachronistically again. Tickets were a thing of the past. Sun Gu followed Onu into the theater. A few people standing by the entrance came forward to welcome them. "Come on in," one of them said. "Would you like to watch the play?" As Sun Gu's group nodded in response, the theater employees looked immensely pleased. "Perfect timing. We're just about to begin." Sun Gu was confounded by their exuberant welcome, nor could he fully process what happened next. The ushers politely guided the guests to their seats and locked the entrance. The theater was empty except for his group. The lights went out and a stage light came on. Before the curtain opened, an actress greeted the audience. "We are immensely honored to have you at this premiere of the Bluebird Theatre Group's new play. Our opening is already an hour late because we've been waiting for someone to show up. We were ready to stage the play with or without an audience. We have that much pride in our work. Still, how sad would it have been to perform the premiere to an empty theater? Fortunately, the 4 of you came. Now we won't feel that our 10 months of rehearsals were in vain. And for that, we thank you." Then she politely bowed and left the stage. Sun Gu was aghast. "I've stumbled onto something serious here." The rest of his group was likewise confused, exchanging blank looks. When the curtain lifted, the stage was empty, except for a light gray projection screen. A recording of melancholy trot-like music played in the background. Images began appearing on the screen. street scenes painted in the style of landscape art. All of a sudden, a young actress glided onto the spotlight on roller skates. She circled around the stage like an agile sparrow for a few moments before removing her skates and laying down on the stage, as though trying to sleep. The music changed into a serenade. Sun Gu turned his attention to the interior of the theater. The location of the stage, the seat arrangements, the ceiling, and the walls all looked similar to old-style theaters. In a world where everything has changed, only the theater remains the same? Or has it undergone a full cycle of transformation already? And how come there's no audience? Are we really their only audience? He whispered to Onu. I'm wondering myself, Onu replied. This theater troupe must be awful. I doubt it. They're all official members of the Arts Academy. Indeed, the company was not bad at all, and Sun Gu very much appreciated the hour-long play. The acting and staging left nothing to be desired, and he was impressed by the minimalist setting and the use of projected images. The plot was interesting too. It told the story of a gifted and spirited Wosidu child who, through a series of ordeals, grows up to become a dull adult. After a happy childhood, the girl ends up having to endure authoritarianism at school, the tyranny of superiors in the army, and an inflexible bureaucracy at work. At the end of the tragic story, the woman falls victim to sexual assault. The weighty theme and polished production, not to mention the outstanding acting, fully justified in Sun Gu's mind the 10 months of preparation it had apparently taken. When the play ended, Sun Gu offered a loud standing ovation. Onu and the others looked at Sun Gu with surprise. Evidently, his applause was more interesting to them than the play itself. Stifling a yawn, Onu asked whether he had enjoyed the performance. It was wonderful, Sun Gu said with enthusiasm. Didn't you like it? We're not fans of the theater, Onu said, stretching drowsily. She had obviously just been waiting for the play to end. Thank you. So this is an excerpt from my short story titled We Were Never Here, featured in the Gollancz book of South Asian science fiction. We actually have, it's only available in India, this collection, but we have a few copies at the back. Very few, so get yours if you want, or when you can. So this is sort of following the vein of other imagined societies of women, and it tells a story of an unnamed city where women choose to disappear into a secret sanctuary. As the women leave the city, they hear about this place by word of mouth, and when they arrive at the sanctuary, they kind of experience a different kind of authoritarianism. It's coming from their caretakers, but also sometimes they find that it's coming from within themselves. A small warning, there's a depiction of sexual trauma in this story. We all left one bright morning when the sun's golden streaks shot heavily across the cracked pavement, as the roosters were still crowing, as the calls to prayer receded into an echo. The dry leaves scattered on the brick road crunched beneath our feet, the garbage bags steaming in the heat, yellowing apple peels strewn about from last night's meals, pan spit blending into the dust, the refuse of a world we no longer wanted. At first, they didn't notice us go. They were praying in the mosque, washing their faces over their sinks, shaving, groaning on their toilet seats as they relieved themselves of the previous day's burdens. Some of them were still asleep, snoring softly as we put on our scarves, packed a small bag of everything we loved, and quietly closed the doors behind us. Some of us had no one to leave behind. We departed from empty rooms without fixing our beds. The sheets softly crumpled, the smell of powder, henna from our hair, sweat, soap, oily skin lingering as if we had evaporated. We rolled off hard mats we put on the ground by the roadside, under the shredded tarp that covered us in the harsh, foggy winter, rubbing our chapped hands, leaving behind the stench of poverty that quickly faded as we walked away, as if we had never been there. Perhaps we hoped that by leaving, we would shed all the smells, all the fat of this gluttonous city, all the heaviness that sank deep into our skin and the skins of men. We had heard whispers pass from one woman's mouth to another's ears, whispers of a secret tunnel running through the salt mines outside the city. Against the crystal walls, where carts were once propelled forward along firm tracks that were now tossed aside, where men once toiled under single light bulbs or in complete darkness. We heard of others disappearing after making their way into the tunnel in search of sanctuary. We heard of her, the mother, vanishing in a puff of smoke one morning as the vegetable seller haggled with her grown son. They turned around and she was gone, her plastic shopping bag abandoned without a sound of protest. We imagined she had given up on this life of compromise, this constant back and forth from the vegetable stand, and decided to make her way through the tunnel in search of something. We heard of her, the young bride who calmly walked away from her marriage bed as her husband prepared to enter their room. No note, just a bundle of vermilion and gold, with her diamonds placed on top like heirlooms in a museum. We heard of her, the tired middle-aged schoolteacher who did not return to her class after the break, whose disappearance was only noticed when the principal realized the sounds of mayhem in the classroom had been going on for an hour. We heard of a secret garden lying hidden at the end of the tunnel, and on the other side of the garden, in an old convent, was the sanctuary. Whatever was waiting for us there, it could be better than this. Anything must be better than this, we thought. We were afraid at first, deathly afraid. Then we brushed the fear off our shoulders, broke the silence with a laugh, the tension with a nod. What would they all feel when they realized we were missing? How would they go on? Once, long before we were here, the convent protected women from another world. Invaders who came with their men, who enriched themselves off our labor and left. Then the convent selected a few of us, the indoctrinated ones, the wealthy ones, the malleable ones. Once we were prepared for marriage. Then when everything began to close down, the convent fell into disrepair. Now it sits heavily among the rushes behind a dark mountain just for us, surrounded by grey rocks and a wind that whispers the past to us in our sleep. Our sanctuary is a large, dark house of brick with hidden walls and endless passageways lined with carpets and high windows. The caretakers, stern women with bamboo canes, tell us in hushed voices to strip ourselves of our clothes, jewels, everything, and line up. Your journey begins with purification. A woman with a long, gaunt nose and drooping cheeks intoned. You are now in our care, says Nose Woman. You need nothing from your past lives. But this is Mother's bracelet. One of us, a girl, huffs at the end of the line. A sharp snap, the stick makes a thwack on the floor, and the girl winces. Why did you come here, little girl? To get away from my father. And why did you want to leave your father? The girl looks at her feet. She has a small face and small hands. She shrinks even more if that were possible. He beat me. Your friend tells me he did much more than that. The girl glances up, eyes wide, her face reddens. We are all women of pain here. We have no secrets. Tell us what he did. He touched me, she whimpers. Every night he came to my bed and took off my clothes and touched the parts Mother said we were supposed to cover. He did that thing married people do. Except he's my father, and I let him because I was taught obedience. Her voice is shrill, and she is shaking. We gasp, shake our heads, tug our earlobes in shock. Some of us weep with her, others pray loudly. The caretakers are somber and wait for the clamor to subside. Nose Woman's cheeks stretch as she smiles. He was your father. You are free. The girl sighs. Her face is now in her hands, and Nose Woman embraces her. She shakes, her arms so tightly wound around the girl that some of us start forward. But she releases her, and the girl, with palpable fury, tears a gold bracelet off her arm and throws it at the caretaker's feet. We begin to peel off our clothes. Some of us have more to remove than the others. Some came here wearing nothing but thin shirts, light shawls covering our heads, escaping with little to show from our past lives. Some came kicking and screaming, bearing bags of jewelry, pictures of husbands, children, grandchildren, letters from old lovers, tattered copies of the Quran. Some of us have soft hands smelling of powder, expensive creams with lavender, rose, flowers that the others have never even seen. Others have hands with calloused peeling skin that smell like soap suds, onions, turmeric, and flour. We are old and young. We have sagging breasts with wrinkled nipples and round breasts tipped with pink, unbroken circles. We left our babies, or we escaped the marital bed. Some of us came here as lovers. Some of us came searching for love. Some of us have marks around the thighs, handprints larger than ours. Some of us have smooth, untouched skin, but burning discontent inside us. Some of us were picked up bereft on the roadside. Some plotted their escapes in secret alleyways, using telephones inside petrol pumps, traveling long distances in the back of a truck. Some of us don't tell how we arrived. Some of us were given the wrong names, wrong bodies, wrong faces. Some of us brought our new names, new bodies. Some hope to find new names, new bodies. Some of us can't explain why we are here. There was a gaping hole inside us, we say. Some of us can read very well and are assigned to teach those who cannot. It is a useful skill for women, our caretakers tell us. Reading has power, like fire in men's hands. We read scripture in a vast library made for us. Books line dark walls in rooms with dark carpets on the floor where we sit wearing threadbare white shalwar kameez and clean faces. Our rooms are circular with round windows, dropping smooth beams of light onto us. The shelves strain under the weight of knowledge. We crave more. We are starved. We tear through the books as if our lives depend on it. Our bodies are free now. We laugh. We walk with our shoulders pulled back, no longer encumbered by the weight of the outside world. A thin wind rattles through the halls, bringing fresh air around our ankles. We sleep in a long hallway, and a pale moon grins from the high windows above us. The wind makes us shiver at night, and the excitement of this new world vanishes with sleep. We toss and turn and wake up screaming in the night, imagining that by some cruel twist of fate, we were never here. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we're going to have a moderated discussion, and Roshi Chen will moderate, and she edits science fiction and fantasy in New York City. Her work appears or is forthcoming from Electric Literature and The Dark.
So I'm actually going to do a couple readings, both from the anthology and also 2 works by 2 of my authors that I'm editing. So the first one is called The Bloody Battle of Broccoli Plain, which I was immediately drawn to because that's a really incredible title. It's also an alien invasion story, and I believe that every alien invasion story is ultimately a story about what the nation is interested in at the time. This was originally written in 2008 by the author known as Juna, who writes anonymously. I also want to give the same caveat as Alice did, which is that my trash Korean pronunciations are because I am an ignorant Chinese American person. Right then, Jansu had no time to think about his ex-girlfriend. His top priority at the moment was putting out the fire on his ass. This wasn't a metaphor. Jansu's ass really was on fire. As he approached the marsh, a cooper that had been patrolling the perimeter of the Olivier had noticed and fired a warning shot at him with a laser rifle. Though Jansu's spacesuit hadn't been punctured, the flammable, translucent goo of the marsh had caught fire, and he was now running out of the marsh with his ass on fire like Yosemite Sam. In theory, his Russian-made spacesuit should have been able to deal with fire of this magnitude, but if that were truly the case, why was his backside, the part of it touching the inside of his spacesuit at least, getting so hot? As soon as he managed to descend into a shallow ravine, removing himself from the Cooper's line of sight, Jansu dropped and rubbed his butt against the grassy ground. He'd managed to put out the fire, but it left a black scar on the rear of his spacesuit. Even though he couldn't see the mark himself, his dignity felt scarred just the same. Calming down, he climbed carefully out of the ravine and stuck his head out from behind the boulder he was using as a shield. He didn't see the Cooper. Oh, wait, there it was. Marking time on his watch, he counted the Coopers guarding the perimeter of the Olivier. If he was correct, 5 Coopers were currently on patrol. No matter which direction he went, he wouldn't even be able to get close to the Olivier. And the Ajani he'd ridden here on the inside? No chance. Just 2 hours ago, things had looked so promising. The Ajani had landed in an open area about 1 kilometer from the ravine. Its signal light indicated that it wasn't expected to leave the planet for at least 4 days. Entranced by the blue fields outside the window of the capsule car, he'd taken a gun and a canteen and set out to explore. He'd gone only about 100 meters when he'd heard a sudden whoosh and looked back. The Ajani had swallowed up the capsule car and all of a sudden was flying back in the direction it had come. The signal light on the Ajani hadn't lied. It truly hadn't been planning to leave the planet. It had merely changed its mind, deciding to spend its time on this planet in the bosom of an Olivier about 1 kilometer away from its original landing site. Jansu spat every single curse he knew at the Ajani. Grinding his teeth, he swung his fists at the emptiness around him, kicking the innocent ground, as if he'd had some right. Having exhausted himself, he again descended into the ravine. A sudden impulse to commit suicide enveloped him. He could end all his suffering by just opening his helmet and pulling once on the trigger of his pistol. Actually, no. He might not even need to pull the trigger. What was the probability that he could survive the atmosphere of this planet? Besides, even if he survived, he still wouldn't be able to return to Earth. And, sorry. Thank you for the encouraging applause. I'm sorry to be reading from my phone on the next one. This book came out in July. It's called The Border Keeper by Kirsten Hall. There aren't copies here, but if you're at the Brooklyn Book Festival over the weekend, they will have copies at the Macmillan booth, so swing by, take a look. This author grew up in South Africa, so this is not a work in translation, but it's transnational in the sense that she's writing with a different English than people who grew up on Tolkien, people who grew up on Jordan, on George R. R. Martin, and anything else. So this is just the very beginning of the book, but I think it gives you a sense of somebody growing up in the shadow of the apartheid, creating a totally secondary world and a pure fantasy, and how they would bring that out in the form of a novel. So she lived where the railway tracks met the salt pan, on the Ari side of the shadow line. In the old days, when the people still talked about her, she was known as the end-of-the-line woman. She had other titles, many more, though most lay forgotten and buried now. Whispers of her presence rustled down through the centuries, a footnote here, a folksong there. Rumors, myths. Yet she did not dwell in a house of bones or eat children or carve hexes into the entrails of men beneath the light of the full autumn moon. Though that sounds great, doesn't it? That's not part of it. In most respects, she appeared no different than most people. She had been called the destroyer of empires, mistress of the dead, the whispers went, but those few who knew better gave her the title of Yawensa, the border keeper. Her domain was silent. Beyond the fine wire fence of the shadow line, beyond the border of the world, lay McAllis. The pan stretched white and pitiless to the horizon, a salt heat haze of mirrors, dreams, and thirst. McAllis, the spirit's domain, where gods and demons waged endless war for dominion over 999 realms. No Ari dweller survived it, not without permissions and a guide. The border keeper's house might once have been a terminal station, but the trains had stopped over 100 years ago. Metal tracks blistered with corrosion. The wind buried steel and the sun transformed wood into pale marble, so that from a distance the railroad glittered like tarnished jewelry. Fool's gold. Many would have called Visethi a fool. Many, in fact, had. Yet here he was walking along the backbone of the desert. His black hair was bound in a loose ponytail, his ear rimmed with silver hoops, a gourd sloshed at his hip. Hidden beneath his shirt, a large tattoo splayed out across his brown shoulders in an illegible tangle of black swirls and switches. When he walked, his gait gave the impression of affected jauntiness. Step, roll, change. Step, roll, change. Extravagant, a waste of energy in the hostile environment. Every now and then his fingers would caress the scar that bisected his neck, an ugly white mark like a root or tumor, an underground thing. He did not leave footprints in his wake. And last but certainly not least, this is from a book that's not out until March of 2020. It's written by Nhi Vo, who is a Vietnamese-American fantasy writer. This is also secondary world, and I think of it as her take on the classic Asian period drama. It both indicts monarchy and is about an incredibly badass empress, and it has 0 white people in it. It is titled The Empress of Salt and Fortune. This is near the beginning, but not quite the exact beginning. I suppose you have guessed by now that I'm quite at home in this old place. It is true that my family is from this region, but when I was only 5, the county sent me along with 100 san of birch water, 30 young goats, and 50 caskets of orange dye to the capital. It was meant to be 55 caskets of dye, you see, and they hoped if they sent me along that the tax collectors would be forgiving. I suppose they were, and I spent the next 4 years scrubbing the palace of gleaming light, never raising my head. I got to know the palace by the baseboards, the wood of the floors, the smell of paper screens, and the way that lamp oil burned all night, never letting the darkness approach his most divine presence, the emperor of pine and steel, Emperor Sun. I might have been a rabbit-toothed girl from the provinces, but I worked so well that when I was 10, I was promoted to cleaning the women's quarters. I was so proud when they gave me the veil that marked me as one of the servants of the inner house. If I could have written then, I would have written to my father and mother of how their daughter, veiled and wearing household green, was lined up along the Paulownia Hall with 200 others to greet the new empress from the north. The Royal Household Agency positioned us before dawn, prowling up and down the lines as nervously as cats and lashing out with their horsehair whips when we slouched or yawned. More than one girl fainted, but I was a strong thing, and I stood like a statue until past noon, when there was a great commotion in the courtyard. We knew from the snapping of banners and the shouts of the guards that the Empress had arrived. She did not come, as her late mother had once threatened, with a battalion of mammoth to bring down the walls of the Palace of Gleaming Light. Instead, she had come with only an honor guard that was barred from the inner palace, and so she walked down the long hallway to the court of the emperor all alone. We had been scolded and smacked and told that if we raised our eyes to the future mother of the emperor, we would be relegated to cleaning the kitchen refuse pits. I could not help myself, however, and I glanced up to see her pass by. History will say that she was an ugly woman, but that is not true. She had a foreigner's beauty, like a language we do not know how to read. She was barely taller than I was at 10, and built like an ox drover's daughter. Her 2 long braids hung over her shoulders as black as ink, and her face was as flat as a dish and almost perfectly round. Pearl-faced, they call it where she came from, but piggish is what they call it here. She walked past with her spine like one of those birch trees, and she wore this dress, which is as white today as it was then. The seal that the dress was made from was killed by her brother on his first hunt. He stalked it for days at the breathing holes where they come from, patient as the unending ice itself. And when it rose, it was as large as a man. The toggle is one of its teeth, carved by her uncle. Her brother and her uncle, whose names are now only spoken in the mortuary halls of Ingresk, were killed just a year before, at the Battle of Koanam Ford. She would bring with her a wealth of salt, bushels of pearls, and enough whale oil to keep the palace alight for 20 years or more, one of the finest dowries ever to come to an emperor of On. But that was still a week away. When she first came to the Palace of Gleaming Light, Inyo was alone and empty-handed, wearing a splendid seal fur dress that the ladies of the women's hall could only call strange and barbaric. She never wore this dress again in the palace, but when the emperor sent her into exile, she asked me to pack it carefully. I was 13 then, and it was my job to look after it. I packaged it so carefully between a dozen layers of crisp paper on top and on the bottom, and every 10 days, I brought it out to brush out any possible moth eggs or larvae. Even though there was a fashion for seal fur in the capital when Inyo became the empress in truth, there was never a dress like this one again. There never could be. It is beautiful, but every stitch bites into her history, the deaths she left behind her, and the home that she could never return to. Do you understand?
I mean, it's all right. It doesn't matter. Unless you want the red chair.
No, that's I'll live with it. Hi. Thank you all for coming. I guess to get started, I feel like we had such a great range of readings there, and so much of it was about this interplay between genders, even when you're talking about these like far-flung worlds of sci-fi. As an editor acquiring sci-fi, one of the things that always strikes me is that it is such an inherently colonialist genre. Like it's born out of pulp. It's born out of really explicit imperial propaganda, and it was it's a training ground to say, hey, these young white boys can go out and conquer other galaxies. I mean, countries. I mean, places. And I think anyone writing sci-fi now has to reckon with that, especially an author of color, especially works in translation. And the story, and it often is still a colonial story, like the excerpt that you read, where it's this utopian all-women society, but it's from this very male point of view, or like the very specific point of view from the excerpt you chose too, Alice. So I would love to hear, like, how, I mean, as writers, how do you both tangle with that in your own work?
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, I grew up on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and the very white male writers of the world. I speak 2 languages, but I didn't know much about Urdu sci-fi or sci-fi that comes from, like, I guess, a South Asian perspective. I've only recently started trying to educate myself about science fiction that sort of is from either post-colonial or sort of looking beyond colonization as from in the South Asian world. And like one of the first stories that I came across was Sultana's Dream, which is a short story, one of the, I think, the first, I may be wrong, but it was one of the first female utopian visions written in 1905. By an Indian woman who wrote it in English, if I remember correctly. And Sultana's Dream is a short story, but it's a very idyllic vision of a feminist utopian world. It's very much, literally starts with a line that goes like, as I was sitting on my chair thinking about the state of Indian womanhood, I started, like, she has a dream and then enters into this new world. And I think that story opened up all these ideas of it talked about monarchy, it had a queen, it had all these sort of elements that were very much what the colonized would think about. There were elements of colonization within that story, but there were ways that you could see she was trying to push beyond that. And I think that story really helped me rethink a little bit about where we can step outside sci-fi and where South Asians who are part of a formerly colonized society can think beyond sci-fi, beyond the colonizer's vision of sci-fi.
And sort of just breaking down that binary altogether. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think maybe my conception of science fiction started out as I think a lot of people have this experience where you read these books, and especially the canonical texts, and you're just you're so young and you want to disappear into these worlds, and you're just sort of like, I can ignore the fact that I'm in this body with these experiences. Like, here I go diving into this, elf body or something, and it's sort of like very easy to do that. But it's something that becomes sort of, it's noxious, right? It starts to wear on one, especially as you become a writer and you realize like you're maybe aping these stories that you would read and not writing from your own experience or anything that is lived. And I think where in science fiction I found like the freedom to just kind of do whatever the fuck I wanted is that like I felt like science fiction was just this like toy box of tropes that you like. I mean, so we're talking about kind of transnational science fiction, right? Like, I think one of the things that's very beautiful about science fiction is just sort of like we all like time loop stories are like a part of science fiction. Parallel universe stories, doppelganger stories, like all of these sort of things are just in this like giant box for everyone to play with. And, a lot of sort of the experiences and just the voices in like Readymade Bodhisattva were ones that were not super familiar to me, despite being Korean American. But I understood the language of science fiction that was being spoken, and I thought that was like a very interesting way to kind of go across the aisle or to, find a familiarity and like a commonality in these stories that didn't have to rely on having this like very similar like lived experience. That was just like, we like spaceships. We like it when time gets all fucked up. And, you know, that's where I started to approach it writing-wise, too, that I could kind of do whatever I wanted because there was this sort of linchpin of these kinds of stories and, like, ways of telling stories that we all loved.
And I love that idea that, like, the link for you as a... Because I feel like there's often such a conflation of Asian fiction in translation from authors who are like working in the motherland, and then authors who are writing in English or in a different language in the diaspora. So like when people talk about, oh, this new wave of like Chinese science fiction with Cixin Liu and all of the adaptations, you'll see the translator Ken Liu, who is a writer in his own right, get like lumped into that, even though he is not writing in translation. He is a translator, and then he also writes in English. So I love this idea that the sort of the science fiction-y tropes are like the translator material there for you, like that it is this connection between someone in the diaspora and someone writing in the motherland, but instead of the common language or the way that it's developed, it's like fucked up spaceships and time travel and like body swapping and all of that. And that's such a beautiful connection, like that feels really lived in and right. Do you have a favorite trope, either of you?
Well, I love those time loops, you know, and I feel like I'm seeing more and more of those stories, and it's just because there's like, it's not only interesting, like like one of my favorite episodes of like Star Trek Next Generation is like when you're like, you know, that ship is in the Enterprise is caught in a time loop, and then like before. Because I saw it in a rerun on TV, like before the first commercial break, it like blows up, and you're just like, oh my god, and so it's like it's kind of a story that's like about the worst happening over and over again, but it's also about like exhaustion and like will this ever stop, and how will it stop? Which is, I think, a feeling that many people can relate to in a variety of ways.
I really enjoy stories that kind of they use science fiction, but they're in a sort of alternate world or a science or a sci-fi world, but they end up being a story about something to do with humanity or love or learning about yourself. So like Ted Chiang's story of our the story of your life, which was made into the movie Arrival. The original short story itself, though, is so much more like powerful. It uses aliens the arrival of aliens to tell you a little bit about like how we perceive our future and how we would act and the choices we make. So I kind of like it's kind of cheesy, but I like you know, something outlandish or otherworldly becoming a parable for something in our lives that we can relate to here or today. I don't know if that's a trope, but it's definitely something I see. I think
that definitely counts as a trope.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I'm always a sucker for. I mean, I always come back to like fan fiction when I think of tropes, which I think is like it's very intertwined with like if you're reading sci-fi fantasy. From my readings, I shamelessly sort of expanded this panel from just sci-fi into fantasy. I do think the two are so closely intertwined. It's almost impossible to split them apart, and it seems like when you have works in translation, the distinction I think is more blurred. I mean, I can't speak for like every territory, but I feel like in U.S. publishing at least, there is this feeling like this is fantasy, this is sci-fi. And then when you see things, submissions, new works coming in translation, that boundary is more blurred. And I think, and part of that is like, you're always trying to you're taking the most outlandish thing and trying to drive it back towards something very simple and human and mundane. So I just totally escaped answering the trope question. But
I have a question for you as an editor. Do you often think that, or maybe you haven't encountered this, but do you wonder that sci-fi in translation kind of loses some of its elements when put into English? I don't know if you guys have ever encountered this in work, but
it's tough buying works in translation because I think it's difficult to know. Like ultimately, you have to evaluate the thing you have, which is the translation, and it's difficult to know like, is this not clicking because if a different translator had attacked this, it would come across differently, or is this not clicking because of the original story? And I think actually in U.S. sci-fi fantasy publishing, at least, the only two Mandarin speaking editors are in this room tonight. Hi, Sarah, in the audience. So it's kind of like, I think as you have like a new generation of editors, like Chinese sci-fi, translated Chinese sci-fi specifically, is really, I hate saying like hot in the industry, but it is, there's interest in it because of Cixin Liu, and because of all of these authors that are coming out, which so far has been kind of a boys club, but it's being filtered through like the channels that they can actually come out through. So I think, and just from a logistics point of view, making that case to your publisher is also more difficult because you're accounting for the translation cost and what you hope to pay the author. So it is a little bit of a hurdle, but I think as publishing becomes more global, like we were talking about how the Gollancz anthologies, it's like really hard to find here. But I think as we move forward, things will be only more accessible because more often publishers are buying up world rights. They want to distribute it everywhere. We're able to distribute things everywhere. So right now it's tricky. Yeah. And you know, the sort of behind the scenes staffs, like there aren't necessarily that many people, like you don't have that many editors who are capable of reading the submission in both languages, and you never know where it's going to come from. But I think as we move forward, it's going to become easier, or I hope that it will at least.
Okay, I want to bring up a topic of conversation. I don't know if I really have this is more of a comment than a question for both of you. It'll probably coalesce, but I think I just hearing what both of you read and thinking about sort of the engagement with, I think, especially Roshi for what you read, like, you know, the engagement with like kind of mythology and like certain stories that are built into like these different countries. Like I am just curious about this because I feel like in some ways like hella American or very Korean American, like a very specific kind of immigrant experience that isn't super, like I don't have like a detailed knowledge of like where my parents come from, you know, and the stories that were there. And I think, you know, as I get older, like, and just going forward from now, like, I'm trying to get that. But it's a well that I'm not drawing from. So I'm curious, like, what you, like, how you kind of draw from that well, if you do it all, if there's sort of like, you know, pitfalls that you're afraid of, you know, especially when it comes to like, you know, representing it for an audience in America. Or that doesn't have like the personal engagement with these stories. I'm just curious to hear about that.
I mean, I think there could potentially be an essay collection that's like how to write about patriarchy in front of white people as a woman of color, because I like that's something like the idea, fantasy, I feel like, not that it hasn't pushed boundaries, but I think there are certain fantasy tropes that we're all familiar with, and they tend to be pretty unfriendly to women. And I think it feels like the 101 is like buy the fantasy or write the fantasy that isn't just calling on the same Northern European tropes that we've seen over and over again. Like I remember when Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora first came out, which wasn't that long ago. It might have been like, you know, 10 or 12 years ago. It felt really, really fresh because it was based on fake Italy instead of fake England, which is wild. Like we were like, Italy, that's kind of brown, right? Like that was kind of like, but that was really like the feeling, I think. And then the danger for me, because I was born in Chengdu, but I grew up in the U.S. and in terms of like how I identify, it's almost completely American. And I feel that disconnect too, Alice, when I feel like there's a tendency, especially in secondary world Asian fantasy, to drive toward, remember this time when we were kings and queens, like when we had empires, right? But of course that's inherently problematic as a presumption. And the second piece I read, I think one of the things that really struck me about it is that it ultimately condemns empire. Like you cheer for this empress, but you also know, like, you know, she tells this handmaiden, I'm sorry I had to do what I did. What I did was monstrous, but I'm royalty, and it is what royalty is bred to do. And that's such a great, like, and I feel like that almost could have only come from a diaspora writer. Like, not that it couldn't have, but I think that criticism is her looking back and trying to find that connection and both recognizing this gives me strength. It makes me feel a certain way in this country full of white people, but I also recognize how complicated it is.
Yeah, there's, when you were asking what is the well that we would draw from in relation to what we know or what we don't know. I mean, I remember when I first read Harry Potter, I was, super excited to like sort of read about this whole world that she created. And then I found this random book that looked at literally the worlds that J.K. Rowling drew from to inspire her characters and all the names of the spells, like hippogriffs and griffins and like all these creatures, like the basilisk, which has its own mythology. So she had like this sort of wealth of mythology, like mostly Western. I mean, maybe with the exception of Nagini, but like, let's not talk about her. But so like she had all this like Western mythology to draw on, and I mean, she had magic carpets in there at some point too. But anyway, so she had all that, and she created this whole world. And like, I mean, I grew up in Pakistan, but I studied in a British system school, so a lot of the say South Asian or Eastern or even Muslim mythology was the ones that I grew up on were very small and limited, and it was only through searching for it that I could find it, because even like bookstores mostly had English books, or all the Urdu books were out of print. And like I found stories just by, through maybe my parents' efforts and mine, like, there were lots of really amazing epic legends and stories of princes and fairies. One of the most famous ones is the legend of Amir Hamza, which is a very big Muslim epic. It's been written in Urdu, in Persian, in all these languages. And I was, and my father used to read the children's versions of them, abridged in Urdu to me. And then eventually I got bored and I forgot about them. And like, those were the kinds of stories that I look back at now and be like, those were epic poems which have so much in them, but like I've forgotten them. And now you're seeing like this growth of Muslim, mostly I think fantasy writers in the Middle East and in South Asia who are drawing on the mythology of jinns, of genies and all these other characters. And I think that that's great. I definitely think that we can dive deeper into say, Muslim or Middle Eastern or South Asian mythology and find stories that we haven't found before. And I think it's starting, and I think it's only because people are literally searching and digging, because it's not out there. There's the academia, at least I haven't seen it like really become available. So for me, it's like kind of cool to find a growing number of people who are trying to build a world that J.K. Rowling had available to her. It was just there. Like the fairies were all there for her, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think I occasionally do get authors who, they're like, well, Rebecca Kwong has already written this, or S.A. Chakraborty has already written this. Like, I'm afraid of being like the second person. And to them I say, and to everybody in this room who like maybe is thinking about writing something, that like if I had to count how many European-based white man-written fantasies I see on submission, I would die of old age. And like, there is this, like, there's so much, and there can be like amazing iterations of that are wonderfully creative, that really speak to people, and become part of their wells, and that people really draw on. But I think, like you're saying, like people are digging deeper, and like just don't be afraid to be the second or third or fourth or fifth version of something, because there's so many different, like J.K. Rowling had that whole tapestry because she had thousands of different versions of what a hippogriff was, and she clearly had maybe read one source on a magic carpet, I feel like, and so I'm like, create those sources. Yeah.
One thing that I found especially telling in this book was that a lot of South Korean writers were either pulling from or reacting to Western trends. And I know that this is definitely true of the Gollancz collection of South Asian science fiction. Majority of the works in there are written originally in English, and only some of them are written in translation, either from Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, all that. So I just wonder now if maybe like the generation that's writing today, are we, maybe for lack of a better way to describe it, are we too colonized in our style of writing? Are we only going to draw like in response to Western sources? Is English the only route for science fiction? This is a very broad, perhaps depressing approach to look at it, but yeah.
I just went into a spiral during that question. Alice, I want to give you a chance if you have thoughts on it.
Oh, I mean, do you have like a spiral response to give? 'Cause
I'm working through my spiral,
okay.
so if you wanna save me as I collect my thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I have anything either too spirally or intelligent. I think what is important is, anyone working with these topics and in this realm, you're not the last. You're on the shoulder of giants or dubious white men, or both, or and it will just keep going from there. Like I think, I think a lot of like why maybe people create it has to do with inspiration, right? But it also has to do with correction and creating something that is not there. So this is my hope. Like I think absolutely I have been like just myself, like very inspired by kind of works in like, let's say, the Western science fiction canon. But I am adding, of course, like my own experiences as like, like part of an immigrant family and like a POC and just all this stuff. And from there, like, I think perhaps, hopefully if anyone reads me, like it will also be like, well, there's this part that I'm inspired by or will take or borrow. But where is this other thing? And so like that to me, obsolescence is kind of sad, but also I think to me it's very hopeful and something I, want to encourage.
That makes me feel better.
And Alice, I was actually thinking of something you said about the horror genre at one point, that it's also an incredibly tropey genre where that has historically not been kind to women and marginalized people, but that there's a freedom in that when you're writing from a marginalized population, that you can kind of, like the idea of horror is sort of inherently more natural to somebody who has grown up with that fear, that, there is this thing that was made to get you. And I'm probably misquoting you here, but that struck me so deep that, like a lock and a key, and that made so much sense, because you take that from a white author, that completely transforms when you take it from a marginalized author, I think. And I mean, this is probably like kind of a gross metaphor, but I do get the fear. Like my spiral is like, yeah, everything is compromised, but I feel like we're like the fungus that's going to take it back. Like it's a two-way thing, because, and I think there have always been empires. There were empires before there were white people. And like this conversation has been going on for so long. And that I think, the colonized land, like, there are wonderful and long and very intelligent academic tracks on how the colonized land transforms the colonizer. And I like to think the same thing is happening with this generation of writers coming up on these sources of Western canon. But I think when you are reading, you might read the exact same thing as your classmate, but you are reading it differently, and you are transforming it in your reading.
Is it time to open it up, or no? Not to like.
Yeah. How are we doing in time?
Hi, thank you all so much. Wonderful discussion. I want to quickly add that I think there's something to be said of writing from the ubiquitous, strange middle space, and just being unafraid to come at the writing from a place of neither white nor POC culture, and being honest about that. So that's my 2 cents on that. But I'm curious about your I guess, lit crit sources, for lack of a better word, on the theory of science fiction and fantasy. What are your favorite lit crit sources?
I think pretty recently I read the Cambridge anthology of science fiction or something like that. I remember the cover, but not the title. It's very bad. But I think Cambridge was in the title. And that has it has a good a couple chapters on the history of science fiction, but of course from a very particular perspective. But it's still sort of interesting to read about. And I know that one of the touchstone ideas I always come back to, I think comes from an essay by a theorist named Darko Suvin, and it's about science fiction being the literature of alienation, which is something that I have always found to be deeply true and very interesting. I mean, more so, for me at least, I find science fiction to be about alienation, displacement, all the kind of immigrant shit in a way, more so than it is about futurist forecasting. I'm not saying it never does that, but it's sort of like gravy if it does that too, and that's not the point of it. So those are just some things off the top of my head.
They're not critics, but they're very famous to old white ladies. Margaret Atwood and Ursula Le Guin, they've written a ton of essays and criticisms about science fiction and about fantasy and the genres they've operated and sometimes transcended. And their essays are they were the first few things I read when I even thought about trying to write sci-fi fantasy. Was what did Ursula Le Guin say about this? And I found that Ursula Le Guin's thoughts on I may never say this about a white lady, but she could write about she could write great characters of color. Her characters in The Wizard of Earthsea, she imagined him as a Native American figure, and she's he was one of my most favorite characters ever. So she wrote and talked a lot about being depicting characters perhaps even outside of one's own experience. And she was and I really liked just how honest and very blunt her work, especially her criticism of other sci-fi writers, was. So I definitely would say that those two are the ones that I'm the most familiar with. Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of a tough question because I think historically sci-fi fantasy and academia have not always gotten along, and there's an insider-outsider binary going on, and there remains in the genre and the industry the sense of, is I think there are still writers who think of writing genre and writing sci-fi fantasy as sort of deigning to dip their toes in something they find interesting. So I kind of coming into the genre, I never found anything super fruitful from sort of critical anthologies, but I think there is amazing work going on in, for instance, I would say Uncanny Magazine has a lot of amazing criticism, and they have great editors who have a great eye for picking out voices. There was a recent anthology called Luminous Threads, which examined the works of Octavia Butler, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. It was, I think, nominated for a Hugo, and I think increasingly you see collections like that coming out that are people from within the community examining what's going on. And on some instinctual, I mean, maybe this is me as a sci-fi editor being Yale University, you can't tell me what my genre is about. But I think instinctively I trust that more and as somebody who's close to the genre examining it rather than from afar or the Ivory Tower or whatever you want to say.
I just want to say great work. Well, this is loud. My question for you guys is, what books or sources of media would you say is your favorite when it comes to fantasy and sci-fi sort of merging together?
Think about that.
Clearly we're all stumped.
We have answers, but they're buried. It's
it's overwhelming. This is, I mean, I'm trying to avoid just like stumping for my publisher, but also I work there because I love what they produce. There is a book that just came out this week called Gideon the Ninth. The tagline is lesbian necromancers explore a haunted Gothic palace in space. It's amazing. And I think it really, like, people use the term science fantasy sometimes because I think increasingly the two genres do blend. That one is a particularly good example, both because it was out last week, but it's recent, and it's a space opera. Like, it's set in space, 10,000 years in the future with an undying emperor and people being brought back from the dead. But at its heart, it's a necromancer and her cavalier. It's a wizard and her swordswoman. Like, that is the actual trope at the heart of it. And you know, the author is somebody who came up through Homestuck fandom. So, like, let that, you know, draw whatever conclusions you will from that. But I think, like, you know, as we see new generations of writers in the same way that we've been talking about people growing up in the diaspora, people growing up on Harry Potter, I think people living in Hong Kong right now watching what's going on, like, that will produce a whole different thread of science fiction and fantasy, I think, and increasingly the two sides are blurred. So, and I think there's sort of less of a wall between the two. So when you're reading from so many sources, increasingly you're mushing them up. And I can say, like, from an acquisitions perspective, I do find it harder and harder to, like, I mean, one of my jobs is to kind of put it in a box, like, not in a way that reduces it, but in a way that's really useful, right? And I think it is getting harder because often you'll have tropes from each kind of escaping into each other in a really wonderful way.
Just to interject really quickly, on my way here on the train, literally someone next to me was reading that book. That's all.
Oh my God.
Anyway, I haven't read it, but I want to. And I was doing the thing where it was like, you know, you want to be creepy, but you're kind of like using your peripheral, you know, vision to the utmost.
They're very good necromancers and they're very good lesbians, and I recommend them.
I really can't wait to read it now. I haven't read this book series, but I've seen the TV show associated with it. And I think it's one of the most amazing sci-fi TV shows, The Expanse. And it's 3 seasons so far. It got canceled, but Amazon is bringing it back. Probably the only good thing Amazon's done. And The Expanse is like one of the, like, I love space operas and stories set in space, and it is like one of the best depictions of just like of war and military conquest and colonization and all these sort of tough conversations about nuclear deterrence and all these things wrapped into a story of a ship and a bunch of people on that ship dealing with conflict and like from a riveted storytelling perspective, it's just so much fun to like watch all that play out. And apparently the science is very accurate. That's what I read on some article. So it is very like, it is one of my favorites. Yeah, kind of like it's like in the genre of Battlestar Galactica world, all that, but hopefully now with better graphics once Amazon gives them their money. So yeah.
Oh, I guess really quick, I really like I like all the spaces where horror and science fiction intersect, because like the best haunted house is a spaceship. And you have things like you know Solaris, which is, you know, not horror, but I thought of it because I thought of Trash Solaris, which is Event Horizon, you know, of which there will be a show, I believe. I don't know how you can do that. And I guess another book I thought of, although it's certainly not perfect, and we have all of these like texts that are not like, you know, we can absolutely think that if we read them now or saw them now, we would be like, oh God, this would be enough to, I guess, like push me out of it. But because we found it at a vulnerable time or earlier or like when we were ready, like we love it. And so like The Iron Dragon's Daughter by Michael Swanwick is a book that I really love. And it is just like kind of swimming in that sort of like Celtic mythology, but also I suppose like, yeah, intersperses like a lot of science fiction elements. Yeah, in ways I don't want to spoil and can't even describe. And yeah, that was something I thought was like so provocative and new and interesting when I found that book, and I loved.
And the dragons reminded me of one of my go-tos for this answer is the Anne McCaffrey Dragon Riders of Pern series. So, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's not spoiling if the series is like 30 years old, but like you think it's fantasy and like pure fantasy. It's got dragons. And I do recommend this with the same caveat where like I came to it young. I read it at the right age, but I think, you know, there are elements in it that have aged not that well. So just for anybody who's thinking of picking it up, there is a world building reveal that makes it clear it's sort of secretly been science fiction all along in a really clever way. And I also was totally remiss. I feel like you can't answer this question without bringing up the brilliant N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy, I think, is also a really perfect example of that, where it was inspired, I think, from a visit to NASA that she took. I might be misquoting her, and the sort of power that's written about as if it's a magic power because it's the ability to control earthquakes, orogeny, and a lot of people thought it was like a made-up word because it felt like such a secondary world fantasy, but orogeny is a real word from like our real science, and she was taking this science fiction core and these ideas and really just pushing them and giving them this fantasy flair. So definitely recommend that.
I think that's a great question to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here. Thank you for being here tonight. There are a couple of books for sale in the back, I believe, that Kaya will be selling. There's still some wine left. Feel free to hang out and mingle for a bit. Thank you so much.